It begins with an object that should not exist. A fishing trawler, casting its nets in the gray waters of the North Sea, pulls something from the seabed, tangled with the day's catch. It is not stone, nor is it modern refuse. It is bone, or perhaps antler, dark with age and the pressure of the deep. Finely worked, with a series of sharp, deliberate barbs carved down one edge. A harpoon point, an object of immense technical skill, designed for a very specific purpose in a world of rivers and estuaries. It is a single, material fact, dredged up from a depth of 40 meters of cold salt water, a place where no human could have possibly worked it. It is a message from a landscape that no longer has a name on any map. The sonar scans give that landscape a shape. They reveal not a void, but a complete topography, sleeping beneath the silt and the sea. A ghost of a landmass, once connecting Britain to the European continent. We call it Doggerland. The scans trace the faint lines of vast river systems, the gentle slopes of hills, the wide basins of ancient lakes. This is not a theoretical space. It is a physical place, mapped by sound waves that pass through the water and return with an echo of something that was lost. For thousands of years after the last ice age, this was Europe's heartland, a temperate, fertile plain. A world not of ice, but of water and wood and life, now held in the absolute silence of the abyss. The artifacts recovered from this drowned world, like the harpoon head, speak of its inhabitants. They tell a story not of primitive survival, but of sophisticated adaptation. This was a Mesolithic culture, but one specialized to a degree rarely seen. Their entire existence was predicated on a deep, functional understanding of a dynamic coastal environment. They navigated its estuaries, fished its rivers, and hunted along its marshy shores. Their tools were not generic. They were precision instruments for a life lived in partnership with water. This was not simply a population that lived near the sea. This was a population whose entire technical and social grammar was written in the language of tides, currents, and floodplains. To look upon such an object is to feel the weight of a history that was never recorded. If this kind of quiet investigation into forgotten connections is a space you wish to occupy, you should subscribe. It ensures you will be here as we continue to assemble the fragments. This is not a search for easy answers, but a patient vigil with the questions themselves. It is an attempt to listen to the faint signals that persist, long after the world that sent them has gone silent. The act of staying close to this archive is a commitment to the possibility that not all of history has been written, and that some of its most important chapters are still waiting, submerged. The end of this world was not slow, not entirely. While the sea had been rising for millennia, gradually claiming the low-lying plains, the final blow was catastrophic. Around 6200 BCE, a vast submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that swept across the North Atlantic. For the remaining inhabitants of Doggerland, living on what was by then a collection of low islands and peninsulas, it would have been an absolute apocalypse. An inescapable wall of water, erasing communities, families, and an entire way of life in a matter of hours. What was left was a scattered, displaced population. Refugees, carrying with them only the knowledge they held in their minds. Here, the first great silence begins. A distance of nearly 4.0 kilometers separates the North Sea from the arid plains of southern Mesopotamia. An expanse of time, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer, separates the final inundation of Doggerland from the first signs of a new kind of settlement in the south. There is no archaeological trail, no chain of settlements marking a slow migration, no pottery shards or toolkits that connect the shores of the North Sea to the banks of the Euphrates. The gap is absolute. It is the antagonist of this story, a void of evidence so complete that to even suggest a connection feels like a violation of historical discipline. The water erased one world, and the distance between them erased the journey. And yet, Some of us are compelled to stand at the edge of this silence and listen. Not for a clear voice, but for a resonance, an echo across the void. To remain here, tracking this investigation, is to acknowledge that history is not just a collection of proven facts, but also a study of profound and meaningful absences. It is an act of holding a space for a possibility that the records themselves cannot support, but which the patterns of human history sometimes demand. This is not a place for certainty. It is a place for watching, for waiting, for seeing what emerges when two seemingly unrelated fragments of the past are held up to the same low light. The second location of our inquiry could not be more different. The south of modern-day Iraq, during the 6th millennium BCE. This was not a welcoming land. It was a challenging, volatile environment of sun-scorched plains and unpredictable river marshes, a place of extreme heat and sudden, destructive floods. It is a landscape that, by all logic, should have required a long, painful period of trial and error for human settlement to take hold. It is precisely the kind of place where one would expect to find the slow, gradual evolution of a civilization, born from a desperate struggle with the elements. A place where failure would be the norm, and success a hard-won exception, documented over centuries of archaeological layers. But that is not what we find. In the place called Eridu, considered by the ancient Sumerians themselves to be their very first city, the earliest excavated layers tell a different story. They reveal a settlement that seems to begin with the solutions already in place. From its foundation, Eridu was a planned community, built directly within the difficult marshland, yet possessing an immediate and startling sophistication. We find evidence of monumental temple construction and organized living quarters. And most critically, we find the clear beginnings of canal systems for irrigation and flood control. There is no long, clumsy preface of adaptation. The city seems to have been founded by people who already knew how to master a deltaic environment. And so, the question that should not exist begins to form. It is a question born not of evidence, but of an impossible symmetry. In the north, a world of water masters is erased from existence. Their land drowned, their population scattered. They vanish from the record. In the south, thousands of kilometers away and centuries later, a culture of water masters appears as if from nowhere, building their first city with a technical and organizational knowledge that should have taken a millennium to develop locally. One story ends in water and disappearance. The other begins in water and sudden, inexplicable competence. Two separate histories on two separate pages that seem to be whispering to one another across a vast, silent library. The archaeological record at Eridu begins at level 17. The material is designated Ubaid 1. Here, at the lowest accessible stratum of the tell, excavators documented the remains of a small structure built of mud brick. It measured approximately 3 meters square. Within its walls, they found a pedestal, likely for offerings, and a niche. The pottery is monochrome, painted with geometric designs. Surrounding this central building, the layout of the settlement shows evidence of deliberate organization. There is no earlier, cruder layer beneath it. The record simply begins here, with a temple, however small. It is a statement of purpose, not an accident of settlement. Above this, at level 16, a more substantial temple was constructed directly over the foundations of the first. This pattern of demolition and rebuilding, each new temple larger and more complex than the last, would continue for thousands of years. The record of Temple 16 is one of dimensions and materials. The bricks are standardized. The floor plan is a clear expansion of the previous design. Found within this layer were the bones of fish, native to the surrounding marshes, and the carbonized remains of offered grains. The administrative mind is already present. A place for everything, and everything in its place. A blueprint being refined, not invented. The inventory from these early levels is repetitive, functional. It is a list of tools for managing a specific environment: clay sickles for harvesting reeds and grain, net sinkers, made of baked clay, for fishing, spindle whorls for creating thread. There are no weapons of war. The entire material culture is oriented toward production, organization, and the careful exploitation of the river and the marsh. The scribe, though not yet present in writing, is here in spirit, in the meticulous sorting of the world into categories of function, in the deep grammar of a society built on allocation and storage. One must pause and consider the texture of this evidence. It is not the stuff of epic poetry. It is the quiet, methodical paperwork of a civilization's founding. There are no grand pronouncements, no heroic figures carved in stone. There is only the patient accumulation of surplus, the careful measurement of space, the predictable rhythm of ritual offerings. The first act of the world's first city was not a conquest, but an audit. It is a history written in ledgers of clay and fish bones, a story of bureaucrats emerging fully formed from the silt. Then there is the matter of the water itself. The earliest canals at Eridu are not simple ditches. They are feats of engineering that require a profound understanding of hydrology. The gradient of the land is almost flat, a slope of only a few centimeters per kilometer. A canal dug too deep will stagnate. One too shallow will run dry. The flow must be managed with precision to carry water without depositing its load of silt and choking itself. This is not knowledge acquired through a single season of trial and error. It is the application of a mature, pre-existing science of water control. The records of the survey teams are cold and technical. They speak of levees and feeder canals, of sluice gates and distribution networks. They calculate the cubic meters of earth moved to create this system, the sheer manpower required. But the true anomaly is not the labor. It is the plan. The system functions as an integrated whole, designed to mitigate the river's destructive floods while simultaneously channeling its life-giving water to the fields. This is not reactive adaptation. It is a proactive restructuring of the natural landscape, an act of imposing a human-designed order onto a chaotic environment. We turn to a different kind of record, inscribed much later but claiming to document the very beginning: the Sumerian king list. It is a document of succession, a list of rulers and the lengths of their reigns. It begins before the Great Flood. It begins in Eridu. The text states, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 800 years. Alalangar ruled for 36 years. Two kings. They ruled for 800 years. The numbers are presented without emotion, as simple administrative fact. A reign of impossible duration, recorded with the same dispassionate tone as a grain receipt. The mind struggles to hold these two sets of data at once. On one hand, the physical evidence of mud brick, fish bones, and carefully measured canal gradients, a world of human scale and practical problems. On the other, a formal state record that begins with timescales that belong to geology, not to men. The same culture that mastered the subtle physics of laminar flow in irrigation channels also documented, as its first political fact, a king who ruled for nearly 30 millennia. The scribe records both with equal gravity. The impossible and the practical are entered into the same ledger. A third type of record must be considered. It comes from Berossus, a priest of Bel-Marduk, in the 3rd century BCE, who compiled the history of his people from ancient temple archives. He speaks of the time before the kings, when the people of Mesopotamia lived without rule, like beasts in the field. From the sea, he writes, there appeared a creature named Oannes. It possessed the body of a fish, but under the fish's head it had the head of a man, and feet like those of a man. This being, he records, spent its days among the people, teaching them the arts of civilization, how to found cities, to construct temples, to compile laws, and the principles of geometry. Perhaps this is a moment to simply register the space you are in. The sound of the room, The quality of the light. A quiet catalogue of the immediate present. A single entry in the record of a day, as we consider a memory that has persisted for 5,000 years. A memory of knowledge brought from the water. Berossa's is specific about the knowledge Oannes brought. It was a complete template for a society. He taught them how to survey land, how to distinguish the seeds of the earth, and how to gather fruits. At sunset, this being would return to the sea, for it was amphibious. He writes that Oannes authored a book on the origin of things and delivered this to men. This was not a god demanding worship. This was an instructor, a teacher, delivering a curriculum. The record is not one of revelation, but of education. Later traditions would name not one, but 7 such beings. The 7 sages, or Abgal. They are consistently associated with the time before the flood, and they are the bearers of foundational knowledge. In Akkadian art, they are sometimes depicted as men cloaked in the skin of a great fish. This is not a passing detail. It is a core element of their identity, a visual signifier that their origin, and the origin of their wisdom, lies not in the land of the 2 rivers, but in the sea from which they emerged. A strange, recurring, physical attribute. One must allow the dissonance of the image to settle. The arid, sun-baked plains of southern Iraq, a landscape defined by dust and heat and the constant threat of drought. And in this landscape, a foundational memory of civilizing heroes cloaked in the skins of fish. The symbol seems alien to the environment, a piece of a different story that has been carefully carried and preserved, even when its original context has been lost. It is a detail that does not belong, and its very strangeness compels attention. We shift our focus now back to the north. A different kind of record extracted from the seabed of the Doggerbank. It is a geological core sample, labeled with a string of numbers and coordinates. A long cylinder of sediment, showing the history of this place in layers. Near the top there is sand and marine silt, but deeper down, at a precise and measurable point, the composition changes. The gray silt gives way to a dark, fibrous layer of peat. This is the preserved floor of a lost world. The analysis of this peat layer is a catalogue of a vanished ecosystem. Microscopic pollen grains tell of a landscape covered not by water, but by a temperate forest. Oak, elm, hazel, and alder. The scribe of this record is a palynologist, counting and identifying these tiny, persistent ghosts. The data allows for a reconstruction of the environment, a wooded plain interspersed with rivers, marshes, and fertile estuaries, a landscape not of ice, but of abundance, now held in suspension under 40 meters of cold salt water, and from this same submerged layer, the tools. Consider the object from the trawler's net again, but this time as a technical document. The material is red deer antler, a substance chosen for its combination of strength and flexibility. It has been carved with a flint baron. One edge has a series of 7 carefully spaced barbs, cut at an angle to ensure they catch and hold in flesh. The base is tapered and scored, designed for a secure hafting onto a wooden shaft. It is a piece of high-performance technology, the product of a deep empirical understanding of materials and mechanics. There is a silence in such an object. It speaks of a mind that was not simply surviving, but optimizing. The creator knew the behavior of a wounded animal in water, the forces that a harpoon line would exert, the precise point of failure in antler versus bone. This is not the work of a person who occasionally fished. This is the work of a culture whose entire existence was predicated on a mastery of the aquatic environment. The harpoon is not just a tool. It is a sentence written in a language of sophisticated, specialized practice. The final record for this section is a number. The estimated land area of Doggerland finally submerged by the Storegga Slide tsunami, and the subsequent sea level rise is approximately 23 square kilometers, a territory larger than some modern European nations. The number is an abstraction. an attempt to quantify a loss that is, in human terms, absolute. It is the cold, administrative summary of an apocalypse. A final entry in a ledger, before the page goes blank, and an entire people vanish from the archaeological record. The work of the archive is not discovery, but arrangement. It is the placing of one document next to another, to see what conversation arises between them in the quiet. On one side of the table, the sonar scans of a drowned topography, the faint outlines of river channels sleeping under the North Sea. On the other, the excavation grids of Tel Abu Shahrain, the place the Sumerians called Eridu. Two landscapes separated by an impossible distance, now brought into the same low light. They are the beginning and the end of a question that has no right to exist. The first task is simply to look at them together. The researcher traces the lines of the environment. The Doggerland cores reveal a temperate plain, rich with oak and hazel, but its lifeblood was water. It was a world defined by vast estuaries, tidal marshes, and slow-moving rivers, a complex, dynamic interface between land and sea. In Mesopotamia, the Ubaid settlers faced a different expression of the same element. Not a temperate coast, but an arid floodplain dominated by the unpredictable violence of its two rivers, and the vast, challenging marshes at their delta. The common ground, the shared structural problem across both geographies, is the marshland. What emerges from this comparison is not a similarity of climate, but a resonance of function. The technical knowledge required to thrive in the estuaries of Doggerland, the ability to navigate shallow waters, to understand tides, to manage seasonal flooding, to harvest the immense biomass of a wetland ecosystem, is the very same knowledge that would be indispensable for settling the marshes of southern Iraq. One environment was the training ground, the other, the ultimate test. The skills are not merely similar, they are transferable, a specific grammar for a life lived with water. One pauses before this symmetry. It feels too deliberate, like a key finding its lock across a continent. The mind resists it, seeking other explanations, simpler paths. Yet the functional echo remains, a low hum of correspondence between two worlds that should have no connection. It is the first thread in a pattern, a quiet suggestion that history may not always travel in straight, documented lines, but sometimes in desperate, unrecorded leaps, carrying its knowledge like a seed. The focus shifts to the objects themselves. The researcher lays out the evidence, cataloging not by origin, but by purpose. From the North Sea, the red deer antler harpoon point, barbed and shaped for a specific kind of aquatic hunt. A high-performance tool. From the lowest levels of Eridu, the array of clay implements. Net sinkers, baked hard, weighted for casting in the marshes. Curved sickles, not for grain, but for harvesting the tough reeds that were the foundational building material. Each object is a solution to a problem posed by a wetland. The act of comparison becomes a physical one. The hands of the investigator move from one artifact to the other. The labels state Mesolithic Europe and Neolithic Near East. But the hands feel a continuity of thought. These are not the generic stone axes of a woodland people or the flint spearheads of big game hunters on an open plain. This is the toolkit of a specialist. A culture whose primary relationship with the world was mediated through water, reeds, fish, and mud. The pattern is not just environmental, it is technological. This recognition alters the nature of the anomaly at Eridu. The problem is not merely that a complex society appeared suddenly. The problem is that it appeared with a highly specific, pre-adapted technical profile. The settlers of Eridu did not arrive and then slowly learn how to master the marshes. They arrived already possessing the knowledge. They brought the solutions with them. The question shifts from, how did they learn so fast, to where did they learn this before they arrived? To continue watching these fragments align is to accept a certain kind of patience. It is to hold a space for a narrative that unfolds not over minutes, but over millennia. Those who remain here in this archive are not seeking a quick resolution, but are participating in the slow, careful work of listening for a signal beneath the noise of accepted history. The pattern is still faint, and to see it requires a willingness to look for a long time. We now turn from tools to structures. The scattered evidence from Doggerland suggests small, mobile communities, but ones capable of the cooperation required for sophisticated fishing and hunting. There is no evidence of monumental building. At Eridu, the story is inverted. The very first act, in the lowest and oldest layer, is the construction of a temple. A small mud brick square, a central point of focus. It is an act of deliberate, organized, communal effort, a statement of shared purpose. This initial act of construction at Eridu implies a pre-existing social technology. A group of people does not arrive in a hostile new environment and immediately decide to build a temple without a shared blueprint for how to live together. The temple is the physical manifestation of an established social order. It speaks of a population that was not a scattered band of survivors, but a cohesive community that carried its organizational structure with them, ready to be implemented as soon as they found a place to stand. One must visualize that first structure at level 16, not as a ruin, but as a plan being executed. The standardization of the bricks, the alignment of the walls, the placement of the offering pedestal. This is not the hesitant beginning of a new idea. It is the re-establishment of an old one. It is an act of memory, of rebuilding something that was known before, a desperate attempt to create a point of stability and continuity in a world that had been completely upended. Now, the final layer of the pattern. The researcher places the geological record of Doggerland's end next to the mythological record of Sumer's beginning. In the north, a catastrophic inundation, the Storegga Slide tsunami, and the final rise of the sea. A population is erased by water, vanishing from the archaeological map completely. In the south, a foundational memory, preserved for millennia, of the 7 sages who arrive from the water to bring the arts of civilization. The juxtaposition is stark. One story is about a people forced into the sea. The other is about founding knowledge emerging from it. The hero of the Sumerian story, Oannes, is described as amphibious, cloaked in the skin of a fish. He does not descend from the mountains or emerge from the desert. His origin is explicitly the sea. The symbol is too specific, too alien to the Mesopotamian landscape to be a mere invention. It feels like a scar in the cultural memory. This detail of the fish cloak forces a re-evaluation. It ceases to be a mythological flourish and becomes a potential historical signifier. A marker of origin. What would a group of survivors from a maritime or coastal culture look like to the inhabitants of an arid land? How would their strange technologies, their boats, their waterproof clothing, their entire water-centric worldview be described? Perhaps as men who were part fish. The myth may not be a fantasy, but a literal, though distorted description of the outsiders who brought a new way of life. The strangeness of the image persists. A being of the water, teaching the principles of geometry on the sun-scorched plains of Iraq. The dissonance is the message. It suggests that the knowledge base of the Sumerian civilization was not entirely native to its geography. It hints at an imported template, carried by individuals whose identity was inextricably linked to a world of water that the local population had never seen. The pattern is now complete, a threefold resonance. A correspondence of environmental skills, a correspondence of specialized technology, and a correspondence between a historical disappearance into the water and a mythological emergence from it. The researcher can now connect these points, not with a solid line of evidence, but with a faint, probabilistic arc of human movement and memory. The pieces fit together with an unnerving precision, and yet, the silence between them remains absolute. The strength of this emerging pattern only serves to deepen the mystery of the journey itself. The 4,000 kilometers of missing evidence become an even more formidable antagonist. the more plausible the connection seems in function and memory, the more impossible the physical journey becomes. We are left with a perfect symmetry, separated by a perfect void. This act closes with the formal recognition of this recurring signature. It is a set of functional parallels so strong that it suggests a shared origin, a cultural inheritance. But it is an inheritance with a broken chain of custody. We have two ends of a story, but the entire middle is missing, presumed lost. The question is no longer whether these two worlds resemble each other, but whether it is possible that one is, in fact, the ghost of the other. We must now turn our attention from the patterns in the material to the agents named in the record. The Sumerian king list does not begin with a human king who rises to power. It begins with an abstraction, a system. The text states, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is not a chronicle of conquest or settlement. It is a statement of transfer. A political and social operating system is described as being installed, a pre-existing package of order, delivered to a specific location. The first act of history is recorded as a transaction. One must consider the implications of such a beginning. It frames all that follows not as an evolution, but as an administration. The first cities, the first laws, the first rituals are not achievements to be discovered, but protocols to be implemented. The document suggests that the fundamental challenge was not invention, but correct execution of a template that was received complete. It reframes the history of a civilization as the history of a project, one with external initiators and a clear set of deliverables from its very inception. The agents of this transfer are named. They are the seven sages, the Apkallu. In the later records of Berossus, the first of them is Oannes. Their role is consistently defined not as one of divine rule, but of instruction. They are not kings. They are advisors to the first kings. Their function is to install the foundational principles of civilization, the concepts known as the Mi-Wei. They are presented as technicians of culture, arriving to oversee the setup of a new enterprise. Their work is categorized with administrative precision. They are credited with designing the plans for the first 7 cities, beginning with Eridu. This is their first recorded function. They are the master planners, the architects who laid out the urban grid, and the sacred precinct before the first mud brick was ever formed. The record is not that they inspired the building of cities, but that they provided the literal blueprints. The cities did not grow. They were executed according to a pre-existing design specification. This detail changes the reading of Eridu's archaeological record. The sudden appearance of organized settlement of a temple at the lowest level ceases to be an anomaly and becomes the expected outcome. It is the physical evidence of the plan described in the textual record. The work of the Apkallu was not miraculous, it was methodical. They were the bearers of a social technology, and the first settlements were simply the first successful installations of that system. A second function is explicitly recorded: the establishment of writing and law. Berossus states that Oannes authored a book containing all the foundational knowledge and delivered it to the people. This being did not teach through parables or oral tradition alone. It delivered a technical manual. The memory is not of a slow dawn of literacy, but of its arrival as a complete system for cataloging the world, for codifying rules, and for administering resources. Writing appears in this context not as an art form, but as a tool for inventory and control. Here, the role of the scribe is cast in a different light. The scribe is not the inventor of a new method of communication, but the first trained user of a delivered technology. The earliest cuneiform tablets, with their meticulous lists of grain, livestock, and laborers, become the direct output of the Apkallu's curriculum. They are the homework of a civilization's first students, demonstrating their mastery of a system of order they did not create themselves. The third function of these beings was the mastery of agriculture and the natural world. They taught, according to the records, how to distinguish plants, how to survey land, and how to manage the seasons. This was not a generic knowledge of farming. It was a specific applied science for mastering the challenging environment of southern Mesopotamia. It included the principles of geometry necessary for land division, and most critically, the engineering required for large-scale irrigation and flood control. We are forced to observe the correlation. The primary environmental problem of the Ubaid period was water management. The primary knowledge attributed to the Apkallu was the science of water management. The record presents a direct, functional link between the problem and the instructors who arrived to solve it. They were not all-purpose gods. They were specialists, possessing the exact technical expertise required for this specific time and place. The physical description of these beings, when it appears, is treated with the same dispassionate clarity. They came from the sea. They are depicted as wearing the skin of a fish. This attribute is not explained as a magical ability, but presented as a simple fact, a uniform. It is a marker of their origin, a consistent signifier that they are not of the land they are organizing. Their identity is tied to an aquatic environment, an element alien to the arid plains they now inhabit. This detail, the fish cloak, should perhaps be viewed not as a mythological symbol, but as a piece of technical information. It is an identifier, a label of origin, recorded by a people attempting to describe something for which they had no existing vocabulary. It is a persistent, strange detail that anchors the instructors to the sea, the place from which they emerged and to which they were said to return each evening. The names of the 7 sages are listed in some texts. Uana, who finished the plans for heaven and earth. Uana-Duga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. Enmeduga, for whom a good fate had been decreed. They are listed with their assigned antediluvian kings, like a roster of consultants assigned to a project. The record is bureaucratic, a simple list of names and functions. One must resist the urge to see a story here. This is not a narrative of heroes and villains. It is a project management charter for the founding of a civilization. The Apkallu are the technical leads. The antediluvian kings are the local managers. The Mi are the project specifications. The entire foundation of Sumerian culture is framed as a technology transfer, overseen by external agents with a very specific skill set. The silence that follows this recognition is profound. The texts provide the what and the who with administrative clarity. They detail the functions performed and the names of the agents who performed them, but they offer no context for the why. Why was this transfer necessary? And from where precisely did these instructors, with their fish cloaks and their pre-packaged knowledge of civilization, truly come? The record does not answer. It simply presents the data. The beings from the water arrived. They possessed a complete template for urban living, hydraulic engineering, and bureaucratic administration. They implemented this template at Eridu and other locations. They advised the first kings. Then, their function complete, they recede from the record, leaving behind a fully operational civilization. The researcher is left holding a list of names and a catalog of functions. The impossible numbers of the king list now seem less like fantasy and more like a placeholder, a code for a period of time when the rules of history were different, overseen by entities who were not recorded as human. The story of Sumer does not begin with men looking up at the heavens in wonder. It begins with a curriculum, delivered by instructors who came from the water. We stand before the Tell, the mound of a forgotten city, and see it not as a repository, but as an edited text. The work of the archaeologist is to read its layers, one civilization built upon the ruins of another. But the most important information is sometimes found not in the dense strata of occupation, the floors, the ash, the broken pottery, but in the sterile layers between them, the clean, empty bands of wind-blown sand or water-laid silt. These are the moments when the city fell silent. They are the punctuation in the long sentence of urban life, the pauses where history took a breath, or was extinguished entirely, before beginning again. In these silent layers, there are no artifacts to catalog, no walls to trace. There is only time, measured in centimeters of sterile earth. These gaps in the physical record are not failures of preservation. They are the preservation of a failure. They document periods of abandonment, of climate shift, of societal collapse. A story told by what is no longer there. The tell is a library, but one where the most dramatic chapters have been torn out, leaving only the quiet, unnerving space between the pages that remain. The narrative is defined as much by its interruptions as by its content. At Eridu and across Mesopotamia, such interruptions are known. The transition between the Ubaid period and the subsequent Uruk period is one such silence. The material culture changes. The scale of settlement explodes. The simple temple at Eridu is eclipsed by the vast complexes of Uruk. But the process of this transformation, the political and social mechanics of the shift, is largely unrecorded. It appears in the archaeological record as a result without a cause, a conclusion without the preceding argument. The scribe of one era falls silent, and when a new one begins to write, he is speaking a different dialect of civilization. One is compelled to simply observe this, to feel the weight of an unrecorded revolution. It is like watching a film where a single, critical frame has been removed. We see the character raise a hand, and in the next instant, we see the aftermath of the blow. The action itself, the moment of impact, exists only in the gap. The mind instinctively tries to fill it, to invent the missing motion, but all we truly have is the silent, black space on the film strip, an absence that holds all the violence of the event. This small, localized silence in the Mesopotamian record is but a faint echo of the true void at the center of our inquiry. The 4,000 kilometers and the uncounted centuries that separate the final drowning of Doggerland from the first foundations of Eridu. This is not a missing page or a sterile layer. This is an entire volume of the library that was never written. It is an ocean of silence, so vast and so complete that it acts as a perfect barrier, severing one history from another with absolute finality. The antagonist is not a force of opposition, but a force of erasure. If a slow generational migration had occurred, the trail would be undeniable. We would find a chain of temporary settlements stretching across Europe and the Near East. We would see a gradual blending of toolkits, the northern Mesolithic traditions slowly adopting the materials and styles of the South. We would trace the journey in the shifting patterns of pottery, in the carbon of 1,000 campfires. But there is nothing, not a single artifact, not a single campsite, has ever been found to bridge this gap. The map between the North Sea and the Persian Gulf is, for this story, a perfect and unnerving blank. This absolute absence is not a refutation of the connection. It is, perhaps, the most important piece of evidence we possess. A slow journey leaves a trail of debris. A desperate, rapid flight of survivors, traveling light, carrying nothing but the knowledge in their minds, and the clothes on their backs, would leave no trail at all. The silence of the archaeological record is precisely what we would expect from a small, cohesive group of refugees moving with speed and purpose, not settling along the way, but pressing on toward a specific destination, a place where their unique skills might allow them to begin again. The void is a clue to the nature of the journey. This might be a moment to perform a small, quiet ritual, to simply mark the silence, to look at the time, wherever you are, and to acknowledge the interval. For the next few seconds, do not seek an answer. Simply inhabit the space that this missing history occupies. Acknowledge the immensity of what is not known. This is the work of the vigil, not to fill the darkness with speculation, but to become accustomed to its depth. We turn back to the records that do exist, and find they contain their own formal voids. The Sumerian king list is a document bisected by a single, catastrophic silence: the Great Flood. Before this event, the reigns of kings are measured in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the text states, kingship once more descended from heaven, and the reigns become recognizably human. The numbers shift from the geological to the biological. The scribes who compiled this list made no attempt to reconcile this impossibility. They simply recorded it. The flood in the king list is not just a story. It is a structural break in the hard drive of their civilization. It is a formal recognition of a line across which memory could not pass intact. It marks the point where their administrative history becomes fragmented, where one system of order ends and another must be re-established. It is an accepted, documented lacuna, a deliberate and permanent gap placed at the very foundation of their recorded past by the record keepers themselves. They acknowledged that their world had a before that operated under entirely different rules, an epoch whose data was fundamentally incompatible with their own. Consider again the agents of that before, the Apkallu. They arrive in the record as pure function, as bringers of knowledge. But their own history is a perfect blank. Where did they come from before they emerged from the sea? What society created them? What was the name of their own land? The texts are silent. They are presented without a past, without a genealogy, without a homeland. They are beings defined entirely by what they delivered, not by where they originated. Their own story is the first casualty of their mission, erased or simply never offered. There is a strange melancholy in this, to be the vessel of a civilization's memory, but to have none of your own. They are like a courier who delivers a sealed message containing the fate of a kingdom, but knows nothing of its sender. Their existence in the record is one of profound and solitary purpose, a function detached from any personal or collective history. They are the ultimate refugees, not only displaced from their home, but seemingly disconnected from their own past. The pattern becomes clearer now. A physical silence in the layers of the earth. A geographical silence on the maps of human migration. A chronological silence in the state records of the first kings. A biographical silence in the history of the founders themselves. These are not separate mysteries. They are the same signature, written in different mediums. They are the radiating fractures from a single, unrecorded impact. An event so total that it not only destroyed a world, but also erased the memory of its own destruction. This is the true nature of the antagonist we face. The water that consumed Doggerland was not merely a destructive force. It was an agent of absolute erasure. It created a permanent and unbreachable silence. The challenge of this investigation is not to shout into that silence in the hope of an answer. It is to accept the silence as an answer in itself. It is the primary data point, the central feature of the landscape we now survey. The history we are pursuing is one that was defined from its very inception by what was lost, and so the method of inquiry must change. We can no longer follow a chain of material evidence, for the chain is broken. We must instead learn to read the shape of the void, to trace its edges, to measure its depth. It is like trying to understand a lost sculpture by studying the empty space on its pedestal. The absence itself has a form, a character, and it is this form that holds the last, faint impression of what is missing. The work is no longer one of archaeology, but of forensics, of reconstructing an event from the pattern of its disappearance. This forces us to ask a different kind of question. We can no longer ask, "Show me the path the survivors took." The silence has already answered. There is no path to be shown. We must instead ask, what kind of catastrophe leaves no path? What kind of journey leaves no trace? What kind of knowledge is so vital that it can be carried across a continent in the minds of a few and rebuilt from memory on a foreign shore? The silence does not end the inquiry. It refines it, focusing it on the human agents of this impossible transfer. We are left here, for a time, suspended between 2 points of light in a vast darkness. One is the faint, submerged glow of a lost world in the north. The other is the sudden, brilliant flare of a new civilization in the south. The space between them is not empty. It is filled with a profound and active silence, an absence that challenges us to reconsider the very nature of how history is transmitted. Not always through empires and monuments, but sometimes through the quiet, desperate resilience of the displaced. The final image of this act is not of an artifact, but of a deep-sea sonar screen. A single ping of sound travels down through kilometers of black water. It strikes the seabed and returns, carrying a faint echo of the topography below. But most of its journey is through the water itself, a medium that holds no record, a perfect void for the transmission of a signal. It is a visual metaphor for our search, a brief contact with a hidden world, separated from us by an immensity that we can measure, but never truly comprehend. The evidence, when gathered, ceases to be a collection of isolated curiosities. The barbed harpoon point, the first layers of Eridu, the sonar map of a drowned world, the memory of a fish-cloaked teacher, they are no longer separate exhibits in a museum of the past. Placed together in the same low light, they begin to resonate, to produce a low, harmonic frequency of shared purpose. The individual notes are clear and have been for decades. But the chord they form when struck at once is new. It is a sound that suggests the entire composition of early history has been played in the wrong key. It implies a fundamental misreading of the score. What we are looking at is not a coincidence of parallel evolution, but the distinct signature of a transfer. The suddenness at Eridu is not a miracle of local invention. It is the sign of an arrival. The knowledge was not developed, it was deployed. This single, unsettling thought rearranges every other fact on the table. It suggests that the origins of the great Sumerian experiment, the experiment that would give birth to writing, cities, and law, were not entirely Sumerian. The first city was not a root, taking hold in native soil. It was a cutting, taken from a much older tree and planted in a foreign land, in the desperate hope it would grow again. This reframes the entire question of our beginnings. The accepted model of history is one of origins, of hearths, from which civilization spread like a slow, warming fire. But the pattern before us suggests a different model entirely, a model of rupture and inheritance. It raises the possibility that a civilization's most foundational moment is not its birth, but its survival after the death of its parent. It suggests that history is not just a story of what was built, but of what was carried from the ruins. The cradle of civilization may not be a cradle at all, but a lifeboat. One must allow this idea to settle. The sheer weight of it. It means that the memory of a place can be more powerful than the place itself. It means that a culture is not a set of artifacts or a territory, but a portable blueprint for living, an operating system for society that can be stored in the minds of its people. And like any piece of vital information, it can be copied, transported across an impossible distance, and reinstalled in a new and unfamiliar hardware, booting up again, as if it had never been shut down. The Apkallu, the seven sages, are transformed by this implication. They cease to be mythological figures or alien instructors. They become something far more human and far more tragic, a committee of survivors. They are the last living library of a drowned world, their minds the only archive of 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge. Their mission is not one of divine benevolence, it is one of desperate preservation. They teach not because they are gods, but because they are the last ones who remember how. The fish cloak is not the disguise of a deity, but the uniform of a refugee. This alters our reading of the Sumerian records themselves. They are not the story of a beginning, but the record of a second beginning. The great flood that divides their king list is not just a myth, it is the scar of this transfer. The impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings become a distorted memory of a different timeline, the history of the lost homeland, a past that now exists only as a set of impossibly large numbers in a ledger. The scribes were not recording fantasy. They were preserving a data point they no longer understood, a fossilized piece of a history that predated their own world. The first temple at Eridu, that small mud brick square on the marshy plain, now appears in a different light. It was not simply an act of faith, it was an act of orientation. It was the first move in rebuilding a world from memory, an attempt to lay down a familiar anchor point in an alien landscape. For a displaced people, the first task is to reconstruct the center, to build a fixed point around which a new reality can be organized. The temple was a memory of home, given physical form before any other homes were built. One stands on that dusty tell today and feels a different kind of silence. It is not the silence of a people long dead. It is the silence of a connection deliberately forgotten. For a culture to successfully transplant itself, it must eventually sever its own roots, forgetting the trauma of its journey in order to fully inhabit its new reality. The success of Sumer was predicated on the eventual erasure of Doggerland from its own memory, leaving only the faint, symbolic ghost of a teacher from the sea. And if this process, this mechanism of collapse, migration, and reboot, happened here, at the foundation of our recorded history, then the implication expands beyond the North Sea and the Persian Gulf. It becomes a potential model for understanding other sudden flowerings of complexity in the ancient world. It suggests that history might be driven not just by slow, gradual evolution, but by these punctuated moments of catastrophic loss, which act as scattering events, broadcasting cultural and technological seeds across the globe. We may be looking at a fundamental, recurring process in human history. This changes the very grammar of our search for the past. We have been looking for pristine, isolated origins, for civilizations that grew entirely on their own terms. But what if there are no pristine origins? What if every civilization is, to some degree, a composite, a hybrid of local ingenuity and inherited memory from some forgotten collapse? What if we are a species not of immaculate conceptions, but of ghosts, each new culture built upon the faint, unacknowledged blueprint of a world that came before? The catastrophe that sank Doggerland was not, then, an end to a story. It was an engine of transmission. It was the violent, chaotic event that forced a piece of highly specialized human software to be carried across the world and installed in a new location. The water was not just an antagonist. It was a catalyst. It destroyed a civilization in one place only to inadvertently seed another, thousands of kilometers away. The apocalypse of one people became the genesis of another. History, seen through this lens, is a story of brutal, unintended consequences. To follow this line of inquiry further is to accept that the most important parts of our history may not be written in stone or clay, but in the silences between them. It is to acknowledge that the patterns of human resilience are a story larger than any single event. Staying close to this archive is a commitment to tracking that larger pattern, wherever it may lead. The image of Oannes, the fishman, now becomes the central icon of this entire process. He is the archetype of the survivor teacher. He represents the moment a catastrophic memory is transformed into a creative, foundational act. He is the living bridge between a world that is lost and a world that is about to be born. His strange, hybrid form is the most accurate possible symbol for a civilization that was itself a hybrid, a fusion of the memory of the water and the reality of the dust. This forces a re-evaluation of myth itself. Perhaps the great foundational myths are not childish explanations for the world. Perhaps they are a highly sophisticated data compression technology, a method for preserving the memory of a core historical trauma in a format that can survive the collapse of literacy, the burning of libraries, and the passage of millennia. The myth is not a failed history. It is a successful one, the only version of the story durable enough to reach us. The true implication, then, is not simply that Sumer had a hidden prehistory. It is that we have fundamentally misunderstood the shape of the human story. We have imagined a steady, linear ascent, but the evidence suggests a far more volatile reality, a cycle of creation, catastrophic destruction, and desperate rebirth, led by the scattered survivors. The most profound knowledge we possess may not come from our moments of greatest stability, but from our moments of greatest dislocation. We are the children of refugees. We are left with an image not of water or sand, but of something far smaller and more potent. A single seed, held in the dark, dry space of a closed hand. It is a complete universe in potential, a blueprint for a complex life that has been detached from its source. It can be carried across any desert, any ocean, any void of time. All it needs is a place to land, a moment of stillness, and the right conditions to begin its work again. It is a reminder that the most powerful things in the world are not the largest, but the most resilient and the most portable. The lights in the gallery are low, dimmed for the night. Here, under the careful watch of climate control and silent alarms, the fragments rest. In a case of polished glass, a single point of worked antler, dark with the pressure of the sea. Its barbs are still sharp, a testament to a mind that understood physics and flesh. Across the wide, silent room, in another case, a small tablet of baked clay. Its surface is a field of tiny wedge-shaped marks. A receipt for grain, perhaps, or a tally of livestock. Two thoughts, from two separate worlds, now sharing the same sterile, quiet air. The space between them is the only thing that is real. It is not an absence of evidence, but a presence in itself. A vast, unbreachable distance made manifest in the polished floor of a museum hall. One could walk from this case to that one in a matter of seconds. But to travel the true distance between them is a journey that no map can chart, a path that was never drawn. The silence in this room is a scale model of the greater silence that swallowed a world and obscured a journey. It is the final, irreducible fact of this story. We are left to stand before the first object, the harpoon point from a world that has no name. It is more than a tool. It is a complete philosophical statement, a sentence written in a language of function. It speaks of a deep, unsentimental intimacy with the cycles of water and the lives of the creatures within it. It is the crystallized knowledge of 1,000 hunts, the final word in a long and patient conversation with a river. To hold it would be to feel the weight of a history that was never meant for us, a memory that survived its own apocalypse by accident. Then, the eye travels across the room to the other. The clay tablet. It is also a statement, but of a different order. It speaks not of the hunt, but of the harvest. Not of the chase, but of the ledger. It is the birth of bureaucracy, the first quiet hum of the administrative state that would come to define the world. Here, the chaos of the natural world is tamed, sorted, counted, and filed. It is a thought not of adaptation but of control, a blueprint for a new kind of order, one that seeks to manage the world by first reducing it to a list. The hands that made them are gone, the mind that conceived the precise angle of the barb, the eye that judged the quality of the clay, they have dissolved back into the elements, leaving no name, no story. All that remains is the work. And in the quiet of this place, the work continues to speak. One whispers of a world that was mastered through movement and deep knowledge of its flows. The other speaks of a world that was mastered by standing still, by building walls and measuring surplus. They are the thoughts of two different humanities, or perhaps the thoughts of one before and after a great fall. The image of the gallery dissolves, replaced by the vast, gray surface of the North Sea at dusk. The water is calm, a sheet of hammered metal under a fading sky. It moves with a slow, ancient rhythm, indifferent to the world it holds in its depths. It is a tomb, but it is also a veil. It does not give up its secrets easily. It keeps the drowned forests and the lost riverbeds to itself, a perfect archive that has forgotten how to speak. The water erased a world, and now it erases our questions with its sheer, placid immensity. And in the mind's eye, this is balanced by another image. The great sand sea of the Iraqi desert at night, under a dome of cold, sharp stars. The wind moves the dunes with a patience that rivals the sea. It too covers and uncovers. It too preserves and erases. Here, the ruins of the first cities are not drowned, but buried. They sleep under a blanket of fine silt, waiting for the patient brush of the archaeologist. It is a different kind of forgetting. One is the silence of the deep. The other is the silence of the dust. The question that began this inquiry has not been answered. It has simply grown larger. It is no longer about a specific journey from a lost coast to a new riverbank. It has become a question about the nature of history itself. Is it a story of slow, steady growth, of roots digging deep into their native soil? Or is it a story of rupture, of catastrophic breaks and the desperate, unrecorded journeys of the few who carry the seeds of a world in their minds, searching for new ground in which to plant them? This was never a story that could be told in a straight line. It is a story defined by its great, central fracture, an event so absolute that it severed a people from their past, their land, and their name. The only thing that remains is the faint, functional echo, the resonance of a specific kind of knowledge appearing in a place it should not be. We are left to contemplate the possibility that the most creative moments in human history are not born from stability, but from the shock of utter loss. What is it that truly survives? Not the monuments of stone which crumble, not the bones of kings which turn to dust. What survives is a pattern, a way of seeing the world, a blueprint for living together. An idea, weightless and invisible, can be carried across any ocean, any desert. It can be preserved in the memory of a single generation and rebuilt from nothing but a shared recollection of how things were once done. The most resilient thing in the universe is not a physical object, but a coherent thought. We think, one last time, of the instructors from the sea, the fish-cloaked sages. Perhaps their greatest secret was not the knowledge they brought, but the knowledge they withheld, the story of their own loss. To build a new world, one must be willing to forget the old one. The trauma of the journey must be buried for the destination to become a home. Their silence about their own origins may have been their final, most important lesson, that for a civilization to be born, a great and terrible memory must be laid to rest. And so we return to the quiet of the gallery. The two artifacts remain in their separate worlds of glass and low light. They offer no confession. They prove nothing. They simply are. They exist as 2 points of light in a vast darkness, and the line we have tried to draw between them is nothing more than an act of sustained imagination, a refusal to accept that the silence between them is meaningless. The story is not in the objects themselves, but in our need to see a connection. Our vigil is over. The work was not to find an answer, but to learn to inhabit the question, to stand in the space between the drowned world and the desert city, and to feel the full weight of what is not known. To recognize that history is not a solid, continuous landscape, but a series of scattered islands of memory, separated by a vast ocean of forgetting. To remain here is to accept the beauty and the terror of that geography. The final image is the one with which we began. The surface of the water. It is night now. The sea is black, merging with the sky. There is no horizon. There is only the gentle sound of the waves, a rhythm that has measured the ages. The camera pulls away, leaving the water to its own deep counsel. The story does not end. It is simply returned to the silence from which it came.